Um, the session will also be posted online once we've finished today. And that's where you can see the recordings just started there. But we're happy today to welcome Philip and Eduardo. We'll be hearing more from both of them. So I think that without much further ado, I am going to hand over to Philip to explain a little bit more. Philip, feel free to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your book, Political Theology of Development in Asia. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. Kia ora koutou, and warm greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. We've just got a glorious Friday morning here in Wellington. The sun is streaming through my windows, and I'm feeling kind of summery, which is lovely. It's a delight to join you this morning to talk about political theologies and development in Asia. An edited volume I co-edited with my colleagues Giuseppe Bolata and Michael Fina, and it's fabulous also to see Edoardo Siani again after some years, maybe, Eduardo, but it's great to see you again.
Good to see you, Philip, and good to see everyone.
And really looking forward also to your discussion of your own chapter, Eduardo. So I thought I'd just briefly introduce the book and then hand it over to the discussion of political theology and development in Thailand. But the book emerged as really the third in a trilogy of books from the religion cluster at the Asia Research Institute in the National University of Singapore under the leadership of Michael Fina. The RE model, the Asia Research Institute model, is to bring together a team of researchers working on a particular theme to provide grants to host international conferences and then to produce edited volumes. And I can't quite remember, which is a little disconcerting, how many edited volumes I worked on while I was at RE. I think I got up to 7 or 8, including special issues of journals and so on. But the 3 books run together with different publishers in different contexts. But Nalika was one of the early, one of the contributors to one of the early volumes. Nalika, it's great to see you here too. So the 3 books are the Religion and Politics of Development, which I co-edited with Robin Bush and Michael Fina, and then the Mission of Development, Religion and Technopolitics in Asia, which I co-edited with Catherine Shear and Michael Fina, and then Political Theologies of Development in Asia. And you can see why I would call them a kind of trilogy. They have similarly locate politics central to the discussion of religion and development. Each of the books is an edited volume and therefore a collection of different empirically rich studies on the particular themes that they investigate. So each of the books investigates religion and development themes with particular attention to politics and Asia. These 3 books are part of a wider series of publications which we worked on, including on themes of religion and disaster relief and humanitarianism, ethics and religious giving, NGOs and religion, and a range of other themes, all of which we kind of worked on simultaneously. My own research, a bit peculiarly perhaps, is that I work on a North American Christian NGO called the Mennonite Central Committee. And most of my natural habitus, my natural approach to research is to do thick ethnographic description. So I'm an anthropologist. And a lot of my own research tells thick, detailed stories of how this North American Christian NGO goes about engaging in its work in the context of Indonesia and Southeast Asia. But in the Asia Research Institute, my, can I say, dubious Asian credentials saw me invest heavily in analytical thinking about religion and development. So that's some of my role in kind of thinking through these issues and gathering together conferences on what we saw as kind of interesting and innovative themes. So just as background, I have two particular issues that I wanted to talk to in terms of the volume, and I'm really happy to take any questions or provocations or disagreements when we get to the Q&A. The two issues I want to focus on are questions of religion and then questions also of Asia. So a key problem in the religion and development literature is the question, how to answer the question, what is religion? I now teach in religious studies, and my own reading is that there is no accepted definition of religion in the discipline of religious studies. And the same holds true in disciplines like anthropology and sociology and others. And this is part of why I quite like religious studies. And that is that you can't get away with saying, well, religious people are like X, Y, or Z. It just doesn't function. Everyone then asks, but what do you mean by religion? And then you have to have a sustained conversation about what you mean by religion and how you go about framing that, and you have to unpack that. And this for me is enormously productive. The political theology frame of this volume invites us to consider religious practices and understandings in places where it might not be immediately obvious. And that is that we can't therefore treat religion as a bounded, obvious thing. And we also then need to consider religious flows that may influence what we might consider even highly secular organizations. And so this tracing of a kind of religious scholarship in and beyond the domains of religion is part of what a kind of political theology does for us. And I find it an expansive and engaging frame of analysis to think through these questions. As editors, we thought three concepts would be particularly useful for thinking through the political theology of development. And we frame these as transcendence, ideas of sacrifice and victimhood, and also ideas of aspiration and salvation. I need to say, though, that we never forced this tripartite framing on our authors, and nor did we require them to kind of suggest that one or the other frame was particularly useful or particularly engaged. And so in a sense, that three-part framing is more of a recommendation of the kind of ideas that may spur further research and consideration, rather than a framework for the edited volume as a whole. Yeah. So I'm happy to talk about any of those ideas when we get to the Q&A. The only other thing I really wanted to do to introduce a book was to talk a little bit about Asia. I find a framework of thinking about Asia really very intellectually productive. But the reason is not that Asia is a clearly identifiable thing for me. Asia is enormously diverse, politically, culturally, and if I can use the word, religiously as well. In the religion cluster at the Asia Research Institute, we had endless debates about where the borderlands of Asia were, and we never solved any of them. And so the question of was Iran or Egypt part of West Asia, or was it not? Exactly where the boundaries were, we debated these, and we kept on debating them, and they are, as it were, irresolvable. And so we don't locate Asia as a clearly demarcated space, somehow regionally separated from any other space. But Asia has, in all of its diversity, been on the receiving end of numerous intensive, enormous efforts of Western projects in development aid and humanitarianism. And that makes some of these issues really interesting. The populations of Asia in their many different states have also, over the long 20th century, been absolutely transformed in the name of development. And this makes a region also very interesting. So what Asia offers is not a clear field for investigation, but rather a decentering of North Atlantic imaginations. And that's what Asia offered us when we were thinking of themes of development, but also when we're thinking of themes of political theology, is a chance to decenter that North Atlantic horizon. That's all I wanted to say by introduction. I probably said both too much and far too little, but I was really looking forward to hearing Eduardo's introduction to his own chapter. So I'll hand it on to him now.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Philip. So the idea, what I try to do with this chapter really, and what I will try to do now, was to explore what shape political theology can take within a Buddhist context, a contemporary Buddhist context, that is that of Thai society, Buddhist Thailand. And so, this theory on political theology gravitates around the nexus between the worldly and the celestial, the human and the divine, the transcendent and the immanent. And this duality, this idea of, an above and a below, is very much a feature of the Christian cosmos, this idea of heaven and earth below. And this is something that I learned in the course of another research project, of which I will speak to you about soon. And so, of course, political theology as a theory, as a body of theory, which is actually an interesting phrase of its own, a body of theory, as if it was again this tension, between the body, the embodiment, and the aloof, abstract and divine theory, was developed within a Christian context, right? I think that when we try to apply to a Buddhist context, we need to problematize this dichotomy, in favor of a greater complexity. So what I've learned is that in Buddhist cosmology, so to speak, or in Buddhist theology, whatever you wish to call it, in the Buddhist worldview, perhaps, there is no clear line that creates a dichotomy between, the celestial and the human, between God or the gods and humans. On the contrary, the cosmos, as I wrote in this chapter, the cosmos looks more like a ladder, like a pyramid, like a mountain, that from the hellish realms, which are, somewhere down there, just extends in the celestial realms. And beings, regardless of being celestial or human, are located somewhere along this ladder on the basis of the quantities of divinity of each. Meaning that, we as human also embody some divinity, just not as much as those beings that we call gods and that we pray. So you see what I'm saying? We embody some divinity. The gods embody more, but they're not really perfect like the God of Christianity. So there's no, you see, there's no line. We're all a bit gods and we're all a bit divine, and the gods themselves are a bit human, as they're not 100% perfect. So I thought I would share, and I'll share some images with you. I'll share some ideas from another research project that I conducted, just to kind of take you on a journey and have you experience what I experienced in Thailand, and the kind of experiences that allowed me to understand and to really perceive how this Buddhist cosmos is constituted. So let me see if I can share. So presenter view. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Can you see this? Yep. Okay. So this is the context of my first research project, which was on divination practitioners in Bangkok. So as you may have heard from the media, virtually fortune tellers are everywhere in Buddhist Thailand. So you see them on the side of the road, as in this picture. serving clients of really all age groups and social classes. You know, just like the horoscope column in newspapers on this part of the world, people ask about love, work, and so on. And I studied I'm also an anthropologist, and I began this research project doing ethnography. So, you know, spending a lot of time with street diviners in Bangkok, until one day, one of these masters said, I would like you to meet my teacher, who is, you know, a fairly well-known diviner astrologer who works at an astrological association. And I wanted to interview this big name, and he said, no, I won't give you any interview. And I can tell you right now that you're going to fail miserably with this research project. Like, okay. And he said, you know, he's a diviner, so, you know, he says this. And he said, the reason why you're going to fail is that you'll never know what divination is about until you actually learn it. And he said, so, you know, I won't give you any interview, but if you agree, I'll accept you as one of my students. Okay, so, you know, I thought, why not? It makes sense. So I studied astrology with him, and this is what an astrological chart, a Thai astrological chart looks like. In this lotus flower-like formation are the various houses, as they're called in astrology, you know, love, family, work, etc., etc. And the little signs you see in them are numerals, that is where the planets are. And so, you know, I learned this, I practiced, you know, giving light-hearted predictions to friends and family, you know, just, you know, of course, to understand what it is like. And I found it just very, very hard. You know, it's not easy, you know, it's not easy to speak at length about somebody and you know, telling them their biography on the basis of an astrological chart. Because what you study at astrology school, what you study from books is very, very abstract, very general. The person in front of you wants to hear about their lives, you know, the parents, the lovers, etc., etc. So I went back to my teacher and I said, you know, I'm finding this very difficult. You know, it's not what I studied. It's not enough for me to be able to tell people's fortunes. And he said, well, the reason why I accepted you as a student is that I could see that you have quantities of high quantities, or, you know, high enough quantities of positive karma. And he said, with these quantities of positive karma comes the embodiment of a god. And he said, you know, he showed me an image like this. This is the god. And he said, this is like, you know, the guru of all gurus. It is the god of astrology. You embody this god. And whenever you tell somebody's fortune, you have to kind of tune in with this embodied god, who will pass on the right information to you via what you may call intuitions. In other words, you know, use the astrological chart and trust your instincts. And these instincts come from your embodied god, yeah, function of your positive karma, of the quantities of positive karma that you have. And he next organized a ceremony, this ceremony. In this ceremony, he put this mask, which, as you may be able to make out, has the face of the god I just showed you, over my head. And he said, with this ceremony, I am charging you. I think he used an expression in Thai, which is like charging you with further quantities of positive karma and further quantities of this god. So, you know, I realized, okay, so karma, positive karma, comes in quantities, yeah, meaning some people have more, some people have less. And the same goes for divinity. So I embody a god more than somebody else, and so on. Quite, you know, quite different from the Christian cosmos. In the chapter I wrote for political theologies and development in Asia, I speak about Buddhist kingship. And Buddhist kingship works in a fairly similar way. So this is the coronation of King Bhumibol Adulyadej, the late king of Thailand, around whose death much of the chapter gravitates. And during the coronation ritual, a king becomes the full embodiment of the god. Yeah, so he gets to embody the gods at a in a very high quantity, becomes a full embodiment as opposed to a partial embodiment. Same as when this man put the mask over my head. Yeah, I embody the gods in a greater quantity. So this is the coronation ritual of King Bhumibol. Over his head, you see, is this cone-like umbrella, which shows divine power, good karma, divinity, that from the heavenly realms descends into his body. And the crown that's on his head, again, looks like a cone. So again, it shows, this fall of meritorious power, this fall of divinity from the heavens onto his persona. And this is a very usual representation of the crown. This sitting on a cushion is a Thai crown. And what you see here are rays, yeah? So this is again, the divinity, the divine power, the good karma that from the crown, from the persona of the king, spreads out to his subjects, spreads out to the population. Now, in contemporary times, this idea of divine kingship, and so the idea that a king embodies divinity and disseminates divinity out to his subjects, also translates into a model of development. So this is a propaganda image of the same king, Bhumibol Adulyadej, who was also known as the development king in Thai. Here you can see, this aura, yeah, these sparks of divinity that surround his persona, and that from his persona emanate toward the land, making the land fertile, making technology available, and rendering, farmers and people happy and prosperous. Yeah. So this is the idea of divinity and of development in a Buddhist context. Development, progress becomes part of the divinity of certain human beings. If you accumulate, if you concentrate a lot of divinity within your body, then you're able to spread it out to those around you and to improve their lives. Yeah, including giving them, rendering the soil fertile and giving them technology or whatever other form of development, of progress. So the point that I would like to make with this presentation is that if development, if progress is this this political theology, this divine power, potency, and if it can be embodied in different quantities by different individuals, just like karma, yeah, each individual has different degrees of karma, then development may be not just an instrument for bettering society, but it can also create a hierarchy. Some people have the ability to bring more development to others than other people. So this means, I think, that when we engage in development-related activities with Buddhist societies, Buddhist countries, we should be aware of the fact that whoever becomes a vessel of development, of progress, may also attempt to use this form of power to rise above others. Yeah. So the idea that development does not only work horizontally, but it also empowers certain individuals to become the vessel of development, the the vessel of divinity, of this divine power. Yeah. And I'll just stop here. I hope it wasn't too much. Thanks.
Not at all. Thank you, Eduardo. That was a very clear explanation for those of us that perhaps are not that familiar with this subject. So thank you for that. So we have a really nice amount of time for lots of Q&A now, and a small enough group that I think will just be able to unmute and, have a conversation. But while you are thinking of your questions, formulating anything that you want to ask, I'll just put a question back to Philip. So after we've heard from Philip, I will open the floor for everyone to unmute and give your own response, commentary, any questions or clarifications that you may have will be open to the floor. But yes, Philip, so first over to you while people are thinking of their questions. I would love to ask for a little bit more of clarification around these categories that you mentioned at the beginning of transcendence, sacrifice, and salvation as three categories that are potentially important to a description or an analysis of a political theology of development. So what are the key contributing elements that those categories bring to an overall political theology of development? What constitutes those categories?
Thanks, Olivia. So I think the usefulness of the categories is that they can be imagined in a range of different ways in different contexts. And so they're not kind of straitjackets or tightly demarcated frames that require certain imaginations. But I can give some brief illustrations of each and be interested in hearing on whether you thought that kind of worked or whether you can think of other examples that are perhaps comparative or more illuminating. So in terms of transcendence, I often talk with my students about a sense of beyondness. And as Eduardo said, that this can come with very strong Christian imaginations of a kind of above and heavenly above and a hellish below, but it doesn't have to. There are a range of ways in which the beyond can impose and impinge itself upon us. I guess I often think of Walt Rostov's Stages of Economic Growth as providing a bit of a classic imagination of a developmental beyond. And I don't know if you're familiar with his kind of 5 stages of economic growth, but apparently all societies for Walt Rostov began in traditional society, and then you have various conditions that take place in order to produce economic growth. And then once you've all imagined yourself as sufficiently capitalist, or in his phrase, non-communist, then boom, you can finally get to the achieved ideal, which is a stage of high mass consumption. And this then functions as a beyond which societies ought to aspire towards. And developmentally, throughout much of the long 20th century, the beyond that many countries were kind of held out as the goal of development was this sense of being able to visit a set of shops like Orchard Road in Singapore, or being able to visit the local mall in the US and buy enormous amounts of stuff that you don't want and don't need. And then you've kind of made development. And so this kind of beyondness has been held out there as kind of the goal to aspire towards for many different countries in many different contexts. And actually, intriguingly, both communist ideologies and capitalist ideologies kind of imagine the same sort of beyond at the end, that this capacity to have an exceptional abundance of material things. So there's one potential notion of transcendence. Victimhood and sacrifice are, of course, the costs that you need to pay in order to get to the beyond. And so in a context like Singapore, famously, that this involved a sense of the suspension of full democratic and associational rights. So unions have been practically banned in Singapore throughout the post-independence 20th and 21st century. And multiple forms of suppression of the right to free speech or political protest or whatever else. And these were often articulated very kind of specifically and forthrightly as a sacrifice the population needed to pay in order to achieve the beyondness of economic growth. And so these articulations of what you must pay in order to get what we all want have been this kind of trade-off logic, which has been enforced on populations throughout Asia and of course elsewhere. And in terms of the very last framing around salvation, this particular term for me is very evocative. We can think of it again as a kind of beyondness or a material salvation with Walt Rostov's framing, but we can also think of it in terms of disaster and crisis and the salvation from there. And often a crisis such as COVID or such as a natural disaster or an economic disaster presents governments with a chance to be the salvific agent, the agent that restores balance or harmony or prosperity, restores a sense of vision for the future promised realm which is to come. And I often think of salvation and disaster as intimately involved with each other. And yeah, I can think of multiple examples around Southeast Asia and beyond, but one of the ways we can also think about this is what happens when a government does not, or a political authority does not rise to the challenge of dealing with a disaster. In a sense, you can see this as delegitimating their capacity to go about organizing and regulating life. They can kind of, in the Chinese sense, you lose perhaps a divine mandate of heaven. And Eduardo, I had kind of questions about this in terms of what happens during economic crisis in the Thai case around these royal endowments of developmental cosmology. But I think that this kind of raises really interesting questions about when you're not able to offer salvation, what then happens at that point of crisis. And I think certainly one of the things we can say about 20th century development is that it really, despite all the discussion of NGOs and community actors, really the state was located as a key actor or located itself as a key actor in achieving, maintaining, and enhancing these developmental goals. And so that question of salvation comes first to the state, I think. Yeah.
You know, it's a great framework to, you know, around which we actually center a lot of the debates that we've had previously in the reading group as well, but just not named it as this framework, I think, a lot of the time. So thanks for that, Philip. And yeah, the floor is open. I'd be interested to hear from the group about your comments and questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Berger from Montclair State University in New Jersey. And I was so excited to see this piece. I do research on religious NGOs at the United Nations and just finished a 5-year project looking at the political theology of the Baha'i community in international relations. And so when I saw this, I was like, oh, it's my tribe. So I haven't had a chance to read it in detail because my kids took up my attention today, but I really do look forward to reading it. And just by glimpsing it, I can see that you were sort of encountering the same kind of epistemological and theoretical and methodological kind of quandaries as you step into like a non-Western, non-Christian context. And so my question isn't, my apologies if you already answered it here, was what did you find to be some of the most kind of challenging philosophical and epistemological areas to navigate as you came in with like tools and approaches and frameworks that have this Western Christian intellectual history? And just to give an example, for example, in studying the Baha'i community, one of the challenges was that the Baha'is have a very specific conception of religion. And so I felt that in order to be true to that when I was studying the community, that I would have to somehow approach the study from this kind of internal understanding of religion. And then that would allow, you know, all kinds of new aspects to be revealed because it was on these terms that recognize the particularism of the religion, and also because it's one of the first religions to define the word religion, which is interesting in and of itself, that the sacred writings actually tackle that particular term. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what did you bump up against and how did you navigate it? And were there any tools that emerged that you might be using in an Asian context?
Eduardo, I think that one's for you. Thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to see you and meet you. I've read your work over many years. Yeah. Eduardo. Hello,
Julia. Thanks, Philip. You're leaving the hard one to me. Joking. joking. Julia, one big issue I had was I never really knew what I should call these emerging political theologies that I was looking at. So I was looking at how propaganda, I'm not sure if you had time to go through the chapter. I was looking at how...
But I have to read it in more detail, yeah.
All right, no worries. I was looking at how propaganda was dealing in Thailand, was dealing with the problem of the royal succession, and in particular, how the military junta that was ruling at the moment was suggesting an embodiment of the development-related project that was carried out by Kim Phumipon, who had recently passed away. So, so what propaganda aimed to achieve was to suggest that the military government was continuing the project of development initiated by the king, and that if the public were willing to kind of surrender the sovereignty to the military would have taken society toward, you know, the desired telos of development, economic growth, and so on. One big problem that I had was I never knew what to call the various political theologies in terms of the religious ones and the secular ones. Mm. So I was talking about how Kim Phumipon was made into a god via, you know, this spectacle of propaganda, you know, the aura around him, and really celebrated like a divine being. So, you know, I use the word theos when I was speaking about this. Mm-hmm. Then what about when I was speaking about the ultimate end of, for example, economic growth? So that, you know, that was also celebrated and glorified as a political theology. Is that a theos? I call it a telos. Mm. Yeah, because it's not, I don't know, a living being. It's, you see what I'm saying? It doesn't fit in the cosmology. So it kind of makes sense to me that I should differentiate between theos and telos. And yet I was wondering, you know, am I betraying the whole point of the theory of political theology, which is, you know, we are making gods out of secular values, whatever. So, you know, this is a question that I remember having, which I do not think I really found an answer to. So eventually I used these two words, theos and telos, to divide between maybe anthropomorphic gods, I don't know, and these ultimate values. And again, I'm not sure how satisfactory it is. I kind of felt I had to somehow to remark that there was a difference between these two. But again, at the same time, I kept on asking myself, are you betraying, you know, theory of political theology by saying, by suggesting that there is a difference between gods and ultimate ends.
So interesting. Thank you.
Yeah,
Food
thank you
for
for the question.
Yeah. Can I just add two things to that? That was really helpful. The two things I would add is that as Eduardo said, political theology as a body of literature does come out of a particular Christian European context. And so one of the earlier theorists that is kind of thrown around and has got newly popular these days is a Weimar era jurist and legal scholar, Karl Schmidt. And Karl Schmidt's work is quite formative, and I found it really interesting and challenging to wrestle with. But he really places ideas of genealogy at the center of political theology. And so for Schmidt, the modern nation state is really born out of a particular Christian genealogy that then enables the construction of a sovereign nation state as a unit kind of endowed with theological power. And one of the problems with genealogy is that it kind of imagines a historical lineage. And although we can absolutely say the nation state in Asia shares some of that genealogy, we just cannot say that it shares, that's the only sources out of which the state is born. And so this kind of multiple birthing of the Asian state, drawing on different imaginations, colonial, but not just colonial, also in the Thai context, kind of Buddhist cosmologies, and in Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, different again, and you can multiply this over the region. Then this kind of question of genealogy, which has been so formative and so powerful for political theology, then gets far more complexified, and trying to wrestle with these multiple genealogies is not a straightforward task. On the one side, I don't want to throw out genealogy altogether as a mode of investigation, but on the other side, I think Schmidt and others imagined a linear genealogy, which I'm just not quite sure we can say is applicable across Asia, but then it also raises questions as to whether it's applicable across Europe as well. The other thing I would say, and this is a bit more about the kind of examples and material that we really wanted to see in the book, was that I really wanted to see political theological analysis of the World Bank and the UNDP and other major Western actors as they go across the IMF and so on, as they go across implementing major economic transformations across Asia. And I wanted to see political theological analysis of what these actors did and how they went about framing it. And so for me, the invitation was not just to look to Asian states or Asian actors in terms of political theology, but also to look to that array of development institutions that are so often regarded as kind of core big D development, and think of them through a political theological analysis. And for whatever reason, we didn't end up with case studies and scholars that did that material. And this is exactly where I would like to see new things emerge over the coming years.
Interesting. Thank you.
Sorry, I almost forgot I was moderating there. I was so busy writing a note about that. So yes, open to the floor.
I have a question for Eduardo. I'm Michelle Garrett. I do applied research through Ripple Peace Research and Consulting. Formerly quite a bit focused on Asia, although the pandemic has me a bit overly grounded in Seattle. And just really enjoying today's presentation, although like Julia, I have scanned and not yet fully digested the readings. My question, Eduardo, is I'm really intrigued by the implications of, sort of the recognition that some Thai Buddhist political theologies may elevate certain individuals as, being considered divinely inspired channels of progress. And that makes sense to me. And at the same time, it immediately sparks a bunch of interesting follow-up questions. Primarily, I'm wondering, in your research and your observation, does that tendency apply to all strains of Thai Buddhism? Some more so than others? And I do not know the answer to that, but I ask because often in my research and experience, I find that there may be quite a range of differences of theological opinions, and you may have one stream within a particular faith quite willing to support political authority that could become fairly heavy-handed with the divine overlay, and the other stream within the same faith tradition might have equally theologically rooted reasons for saying, no, we're not going there. So wondering how you see that, whether there's any diversity in Thai Buddhism around this issue or not, and what implications that has for politics.
Yes, hi, Michelle, thanks. Very, very good question. So I'm an anthropologist, and I've mainly worked with divination practitioners and mediums. And I'm now extending my research to Buddhist kingship. And, you know, in some of my exchanges with my research participants, so again, you know, diviners and spirit mediums, I discussed issues of democratization. You know, many of them are, they take a pro-democracy side in the ongoing political crisis in Thailand. So, you know, they wish to see Thailand become a democracy, and they wish to see that all Thai citizens have equal access to sovereignty, sovereign power. What I find interesting is that these ideas of karma that I discussed, karma and divinity, yeah, which, as I said, are explained to me as you know, forms of power, forms of potency that come in degrees, therefore leading to a hierarchy. These very ideas are very open to interpretation and appropriation. Yeah. So I haven't, you know, I've written a paper about cosmology making, so as to how different individuals, and in particular religious teachers, creatively engage with this cosmology. So definitely there is, you know, there is agency, and there is a lot of freedom that individuals take as they make sense of the cosmos. I found that some pro-democracy, so to speak, religious teachers, they talk about karma as something that these days, so that, you know, temporally these days, is spread horizontally to all the citizens of Thailand. So this is very interesting. So that when they speak about positive karma in this context, they use the word barami, which you may know comes from the Pali parami, which means perfection. And it is actually the good merit of a sovereign. So they say every Thai citizen now has barami. So every Thai citizen has enough of this meritorious power to be included in the political community as a, you know, as a sovereign being, I suppose. So very interesting. So you see, they still use this karma, and I suppose that they take into account the implications of, you know, karma being something that people accumulate in different degrees. But yet they say every Thai citizen now has, you know, enough merit so as to call it barami, so as to call it the karma of a sovereign. As a result, every individual should be taken in, you know, should be included in the political community. Other people, you know, for example, Funahashi has written a very good paper about this. Other individuals, maybe more conservative ones, do use more, I'm not sure if conservative is the right word, but, you know, more textbook perhaps, notions of karma to justify hierarchy and the exclusion of certain individuals from the democratic system. So, for example, conservative forces might say, we cannot hold elections because not all individuals have the wisdom, have the good karma that is required to be a responsible citizen. Yeah. So very same ideas of karma. I haven't met anyone who questions them, but they can be interpreted in very different ways. And at the same time, I think they can support both a very, again, conservative, traditional, whatever agenda, and a more liberal, democratic, whatever one at the same time. I hope this answers your question.
It does, and it's fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I jump in with a kind of a follow-up to Michelle? I'm Alana Moore. I look at mostly Christian faith-based agencies, and I'm coming from the Australian National University, so it is only just dawn here too, but beautiful here as well. And this is mostly for Eduardo, but I guess Philip may, of course, have some great insights to add as well. And like Michelle, I really resonated with me. It really piqued my interest that you talked about how the framing here means that development doesn't necessarily generate equality, or the goal from this cosmos is not necessarily equality, but may actually be hierarchy, as those who, this is me kind of trying to understand what you were saying, as those who are kind of empowered by development are then more able to fully embody the divine and disperse it to others. And of course, from, again, the perspective of looking at the role of mostly Western-based Christian NGOs in the Asia-Pacific region, equality for them is something that is kind of a foundational principle of development. And I would say kind of part of that secularized notion that we've taken from that Christian heritage as well, for understandings of development. And I'm thinking particularly of critiques of child sponsorship in this realm, which talk about how child sponsorship is unequal, and that is in itself a reason to critique and get rid of child sponsorship schemes, because they cause these unequitable outcomes amongst communities that can cause division and jealousy, for example. And I just would really love you to kind of talk more about these questions of what are the implications of these fundamentally different understandings of the way that development looks like instantiated in a community. Are they irreconcilable, and how does that affect the way that kind of different communities doing development together, or perhaps one community trying to do development on another, kind of how that looks for the way that we understand what the gods, the ultimate aims here are.
Eduardo, that's totally for you.
Again, not an easy one, man. Not an easy one. Alana, thank you. It's not really something that I worked on, so I'll just think loud, as they say. Yeah. The first word that comes to mind is agency. Okay, easy. I think the best thing for me to do is to speak again about my own research project. So when I went there, when I was conducting fieldwork among these divination practitioners, I was coming from the University of London. I was this, white guy speaking Thai, coming from a prestigious university, doing a PhD, right? And so, perhaps my ontological status may be compared to that of a foreign development agency. Yeah. And what I saw immediately was that the diviners were appropriating me for feeding into their own centers of power. Meaning, I go and speak with a certain master. This master immediately thinks about how I may become an instrument for him to legitimize himself in the eyes of fellow diviners, of rivals and colleagues. Yeah. So I think that when a foreign agency, I would imagine, works in Thailand, I would imagine Thai agents to see this foreign agency as as an instrument, yeah, as an instrument that they may use to imply I really don't want to use certain words, such as, the issue, really the key word, I think, the key takeaway from this notion of, embodied divinity, degrees of divinity, degrees of political theologies included of development, is competition. So, whenever this thing, this political theology of whatever it is, divinity rather than development, whenever this comes into degrees, you have competition. You have different individuals claiming to have more than other. Yeah. So to me, as soon as an agent, be the white anthropologist rather than the development agency, enters this community, this cosmos, is immediately understood as, an instrument that certain individuals or certain organizations may use in this competition game. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not really quite sure if this answers your question. I know it's very abstract. I'm trying to draw the scenario that you presented to me into what is familiar to me. So, the community of divination practitioners with whom I work. I don't know, Philip, do you want to add anything? Maybe help me out with this.
I think it's, g'day, Alana. I think that's just a terrific question. And I think the invitation here is to do something like a political theology of developmental equality. How did we come to imagine that equality was something which development was supposed to produce? And I think we can say the terrain is just enormously contested, including senses in which equality have been held up as goals of developmental ambitions, and yet development is kind of premised upon its inverse. It's premised upon inequality. And so these tensions are right there at the very core of development. But I think we can then locate ideas of development, of equality, as emerging out of particular senses of this kind of salvific, transcendent beyond that is simply not transposable to every developmental imagination and context. And so I think equality has a profoundly checkered history. And that is an interesting terrain to look at the contested political theologies of development. That's what I would say. I think Eduardo's conversation in the specific context of Thailand is really interesting for that. And Alana, you're quite right to pick up on senses of the kind of political theologies of development in Thailand kind of enforcing and reinforcing pronounced hierarchies. And I think that's very astute. I think, however, we can look at the ways in which development has produced pronounced hierarchies right across the board, from the development experts who declare that they uniquely have the capacity to intervene in far-reaching ways into other people's lives and economies and societies and religions in the name of knowing this transcendent other which they can bring uniquely and distinctly. I think that's actually, I'd love to see a full kind of discussion of the political theology of developmental equality in all its fraughtness. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. A very complicated note to end on, really, that will leave us thinking. It does remind me of just some of what we've been experiencing recently. That so many times the big UN agencies default to working with one partner, and they create a hierarchy of faith actors in the country where they're working. So this hierarchy question, the agency that you brought up, Eduardo, as well, is huge. I mean, these are all the things that we circulate around a lot. So I think, though, we are over the hour, so I am going to wrap up now. If you do have any further questions for Philip or Eduardo, we'd be very happy to pass them on. Or equally, Philip and Eduardo, feel free to share your contact information or anything in the chat. We will be, the next session we will be hosting on the 11th of November, and that's with John Blevins speaking about his work looking at faith actor perspectives on COVID-19 across 7 case studies. We will be sending out to the email list the usual information. We'll be back at the 9 a.m. EST time slot for that. But I think that's everything for now. So thank you very much thank you to Philip and Eduardo for your presentations, and thank you to everyone else for the discussion and conversation.
Thanks so much.